Yeah, and we've got a lot of ground to cover with it today.
We really do.
So let's jump right into it. Integrating complex spiritual terminology seamlessly with physical instructions enhances the practitioner's focus without overwhelming them during moments of physical strain.
Right, because if you look at the text, the pacing of those instructions is, it's pretty intense right out of the gate.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the text asks the practitioner to lie face down, put their hands on their chest, place their nose on the ground, and then raise their thighs 1 foot high for 11 seconds.
Which is hard enough on its own.
Right. But then, almost immediately, the instruction references verse 10 of the Garn Samhita, and it starts talking about forcing prana into the sushumna and, conquering death.
Yeah, that's a massive pivot.
It's like trying to process these massive existential concepts, like conquering death, while simultaneously straining to hold your thighs off the floor. It's basically like trying to read a dense philosophy textbook while doing a heavy plank.
That is exactly what it feels like. And I want to look at the mechanics of what is happening in the brain at that exact moment. Because clearly, the author wants to elevate the physical movement into a spiritual realm.
Which makes sense, yeah. That's the core of this whole tradition.
Exactly. The weakness, however, is that this abrupt juxtapositioning of mechanical body positioning and, high-level esoteric outcomes creates a really heavy cognitive load.
It's just too much at once.
Way too much. When a practitioner is actively struggling with a physical hold like that, their sympathetic nervous system is highly engaged. Their brain is entirely occupied with fighting gravity, maintaining the posture, and, managing the sudden spike in their heart rate.
Right, your body is essentially screaming at you. Your muscles are trembling.
Exactly. And demanding that they also visualize Kundalini awakening or the movement of prana, it creates immense friction in the mind. It effectively shatters the meditative receptive state required for insomnia relief.
Because you're basically asking the brain to perform intense somatic work and intense intellectual translation at the exact same time.
Yes. And let's break down why that simultaneous demand is so detrimental to someone who is just trying to fall asleep. Decoding ancient Sanskrit concepts or visualizing esoteric energy channels requires a tremendous amount of active processing from the prefrontal cortex.
Right.
And when the prefrontal cortex is firing like that, your brainwaves are pushed into high-frequency beta states or even gamma states. But the ultimate goal of this Kriya is to lead the user into a state where they fall asleep like a statue.
Which means they need calming alpha or theta brainwaves, right?
Exactly. You cannot force a theta state while actively demanding beta-level intellectual translation. It's just a neurological contradiction.
So the user is stuck in this bottleneck. They're trying to process the how, like the physical strain of lifting their legs, and the why, the metaphysical purpose of conquering death, at the exact same moment?
Yeah. So the actionable suggestion here is to separate that metaphysical framing from the immediate, real-time physical guidance. You don't have to remove the spiritual depth of the Garn Samhita or those Kundalini concepts.
You definitely want to keep those.
Right, you just have to sequence them differently so the practitioner's mind can actually absorb them without neurological interference. Give the brain only one job at a time.
And if you look at the transcript, the source material actually has built-in pauses where this could fit beautifully.
Oh, yeah?
Because the user is instructed to drop their legs and rest for 11 counts between the active holds. That seems like a prime opportunity.
It is the perfect opportunity. For a concrete example, the guide could front-load the spiritual framing, like the concept of conquering death, before the 11-count sequence even begins.
Set the intention first.
Exactly. Set that metaphysical intention while the body is entirely at rest and the prefrontal cortex actually has the bandwidth to understand it. Then, during the actual physical hold, strip the audio back entirely to focus purely on counting and bodily cues.
Just focus on the numbers, 1 through 11.
Yes. Or, alternatively, you could save those deeper Kundalini concepts for the moments when the user drops their legs and is explicitly instructed to breathe in a relaxed way.
Right, when they're recovering.
Yeah. I mean, these are just a few out of many possible ways to structure the flow. You could front-load the philosophy, reserve it for the recovery pauses, or put it at the end. The core principle is just avoiding the demand for heavy intellectual translation during moments of peak physical stress.
Okay, so building directly on that challenge of holding those difficult physical poses, We need to look at how the guide supports the user's mind, right in the thick of that physical strain.
Right.
Because anchoring the practitioner's attention with specific sensory cues during difficult physical holds prevents mental wandering and anxiety about the duration of the pose.
Yeah, when you have someone holding a brutally difficult pose, you absolutely have to give them an anchor.
Right. So let's look closely at the section discussing the second and third steps. The practitioner is asked to contract their bowels above and below the navel for 21 counts, and eventually they combine it with the leg raise.
Which is an incredibly demanding sequence.
It really is. And the text makes a very specific observation here. It tells the user that their breathing is suffering. It notes that the body is suffering for prana. And it warns that when they can't hold it, they will start counting too quickly.
And I find the psychological impact of those specific word choices highly problematic for an audience battling insomnia.
Okay, but wait, let me push back a little bit on that.
Sure.
Isn't acknowledging that the body is suffering for prana a necessary, honest part of guiding someone through an intense Kundalini awakening process? I mean, doesn't the user need to know they are doing it right? If they feel that intense struggle and the guide validates it, doesn't that prove the Kriya is actually working?
That's a fair point. Honesty in a rigorous physical practice is incredibly important. And validating the practitioner's effort is a very strong pedagogical tool.
Right.
However, the weakness here is that pointing out the suffering and the urge to rush the count without offering a productive focal point to manage that struggle, it actively induces anxiety.
Ah, I see what you mean.
Yeah, we have to consider the psychological profile of an insomniac. By definition, someone suffering from chronic insomnia is already hyperfixated on the passing of time and the stress of not achieving a desired physical state.
Right, they're the ones lying in bed agonizing over the clock all night.
Exactly. So when the guide says you will count quickly because your body is suffering, it basically creates a self-fulfilling prophecy. It introduces performance anxiety directly into the pose.
It is the classic don't think of a white bear problem.
Yes, ironic process theory.
And they're going to count too fast? The absolute only thing their brain can focus on is their struggling breath and how rapidly their mind is ticking through the numbers to escape the pain.
Let's trace the physiology of that panic for a second. Anxiety about failing the pose or rushing the count signals the amygdala that there is a threat. The amygdala triggers the HPA axis, the hypothalamus, pituitary, and adrenal glands, and floods the practitioner's system with cortisol and adrenaline.
Which is the exact opposite of what you want before bed.
Exactly. Cortisol is the biological antagonist to melatonin. Its entire evolutionary purpose is to prepare you to fight or flee, which is deeply counterproductive to the ultimate goal of falling asleep like a statue. The mind needs a tether during a difficult hold, not a mirror reflecting its own panic.
So the actionable suggestion here is to replace those observations of the user's struggle with active sensory focal points that align with the ultimate goal of deep relaxation.
Precisely. Ground them in the reality of the sensation, but frame it constructively.
Because you want to utilize bottom-up processing, where attention is drawn to localized physical sensations, rather than top-down rumination, where the mind just spirals into worry about failing a 21-count hold.
Yes, the physical demand of holding the bowels up and back while raising the thighs is undeniably intense. You can't just tell them to imagine a peaceful beach while their core is shaking. The brain will reject that as a lie. You have to give the anxious mind a job to do that doesn't involve monitoring its own suffering.
So what does that actually look like in practice for a Kriya that is this demanding?
Well, as a concrete example, instead of telling the listener their breathing is suffering, cue them to focus entirely on the heat building in their lower abdomen.
Oh, that makes sense.
Yeah, and interestingly, the transcript later features chants of heat, heat, heat. So this actually aligns perfectly with the author's broader intent. Directing their attention to that warmth turns the physical strain into a tangible, productive sensation of energy generation.
Right.
Or, another option, you could provide a steady, rhythmic mental anchor for those 21 counts, such as instructing them to match the count to the pulsing of their own heartbeat.
That's a great idea.
It forces the mind to internalize and harmonize with the body's natural rhythm rather than fighting against the agonizing duration of the hold. And again, these are just a few options out of all the possible ways to ground the user's attention. You could focus on the heartbeat, or the friction against the mat, or the air leaving the nostrils. The goal is always just swapping out the narrative of suffering for a narrative of focused observation.
Okay, so zooming out from that minute-to-minute sensory experience, we need to look at how these physical exertions align with the overarching promises made to the listener at the very beginning of the piece. Grounding the bold promises of a practice in its immediate observable physical benefits builds vital trust with an audience that may be deeply frustrated by chronic issues.
Yes, the big picture context is huge here.
Because the text starts incredibly high expectations right out of the gate. It promises to completely heal all sleep and dream-related disorders and nightmares and lead to higher conscious sleep, all within an 11-day commitment.
And from an outsider's perspective, those are just astronomical claims to make without immediately providing a logical framework to support them.
Right. I mean, offering someone total liberation from nightmares and the awakening of cosmic energy when they simply clicked a guide for insomnia, it's a bit like promising someone a trip to the moon when they just ask for directions to a quiet room.
That is a perfect analogy. The scale of the solution just feels overwhelmingly disproportionate to the immediate practical need of the user.
Exactly.
And let's look at this from the perspective of that deeply exhausted, highly skeptical listener. These massive spiritual promises, while they're likely completely authentic to the author's tradition, and within the context of a dedicated ashram, they make perfect sense, the weakness here is that presenting them without a grounding mechanism risks alienating a purely practical listener who is simply desperate for a good night's sleep.
Right. Because the text doesn't clearly explain why raising the legs and holding the bowels cures insomnia.
Yes, and that creates a massive credibility gap. An insomniac who has tried everything from prescription medication to white noise machines is going to hear, "This practice will awaken Kundalini and end all nightmares," and their analytical mind will immediately reject it as snake oil. It sounds too good to be true because it lacks a mechanical explanation.
They need a bridge. They need to understand how the physical strain we just spent all this time analyzing actually translates into the deep restorative sleep they are being promised.
Exactly.
So the actionable suggestion here is to bridge this gap by directly connecting the intense physical actions of the Kriya to the immediate physiological exhaustion they induce, using that as the gateway to the spiritual benefits.
You have to validate the spiritual promise through a physical mechanism that the skeptical mind can readily accept. Use the undeniable, scientifically sound physical reality as the gateway to introduce those esoteric benefits. The body's biological response to this specific Kriya is incredibly powerful, and letting the practitioner in on that secret only deepens their respect for the tradition.
Let's actually break down the mechanics of what the body is doing here, because it's fascinating.
Let's do it.
When you hold your legs up and contract your core for 11 or 21 seconds, you are temporarily elevating your heart rate, spiking your blood pressure, and heavily stressing the skeletal muscles. It's a localized, acute stressor.
Right.
But when you finally release that tension and drop your legs, there is a sudden, massive rush of blood back through the extremities. The central nervous system recognizes that the acute stressor event is over, and it enforces a massive parasympathetic rebound.
The rest and digest mode?
Exactly. The heart rate plummets, blood vessels dilate, and the nervous system basically forces the body into a state of heavy, immobile relaxation to recover from the strain.
And that parasympathetic rebound is the exact mechanism that cures the insomnia. And that needs to be articulated in the guide. An insomniac is typically trapped in a low-level sympathetic loop, right? Their body is constantly humming with baseline anxiety, which is what prevents sleep.
Yeah, they just can't turn off.
So this Kriya doesn't just casually tire them out. It actively forces the sympathetic nervous system to an artificial peak so that it has no choice but to crash into a deep parasympathetic recovery state. That forced biological override is what creates that heavy, statue-like feeling the text promises.
And how does that translate to the promise of ending nightmares? Because that is a very specific claim the transcript makes.
Well, nightmares and disturbed dream states are frequently the result of an overactive, unresolved sympathetic nervous system carrying the accumulated stress of the day into the REM cycle.
Ah, okay.
The brain is basically trying to process excess cortisol and anxiety while you sleep, which manifests as terrifying imagery. By forcing this massive spike and subsequent crash in the nervous system right before bed through the Kriya, you are essentially wiping the physiological slate clean. You are exhausting the body's stress response so thoroughly that it cannot carry that anxiety into the dream state.
Wow, when you explain it like that, the 11-day commitment to cure nightmares suddenly doesn't sound mystical at all. It sounds like a rigorous, highly logical biological protocol.
Exactly. So, as a concrete example, the author could just add a brief sentence explaining how contracting the bowels and thighs actively exhausts the nervous system, leading naturally to that heavy statue-like feeling.
Just give them the mechanics.
Right. When the listener understands that the physical exhaustion acts as a forced override for an anxious mind, the spiritual outcomes suddenly feel grounded and achievable. Furthermore, you can frame the 11-day commitment as a biological reset of the vagal tone and breathing patterns that naturally opens the door to Yoga Nidra rather than relying solely on the promise of Kundalini.
That makes so much sense.
And again, these are just a few ways to build a bridge between practical relief and spiritual depth. The specific implementation is flexible. The point is simply to provide a logical, observable mechanism so the skeptical mind can finally drop its guard and buy into the deeper spiritual journey.
Yeah, it really comes down to meeting the listener where they are. If they are lying awake at 3 a.m., staring at the ceiling, analyzing every sound in the house, they need to know that the sweat and strain of this specific Kriya is serving a direct mechanical purpose and turning off their racing thoughts.
Yeah, if you secure their trust with the biology, they will gladly follow you into the theology.
Definitely. Well, we've covered a lot of vital ground today. First, we explored reducing cognitive load by separating the complex metaphysical theory from the immediate physical instructions, allowing the user's mind to stay clear.
Right. Giving the brain one job at a time.
Exactly. Second, we discussed swapping out observations of suffering for active sensory anchors, giving the anxious mind a productive focal point rather than highlighting its struggle. And finally, we looked at how bridging the gap between profound spiritual promises and undeniable physiological mechanics builds crucial trust with a highly skeptical audience.
Yeah, it is all about paving a smoother, more logical path for the practitioner.
Thanks so much to the author for submitting this transcript. We'd love to see how this practice evolves, so please send your revisions or future work back to us for another critique.